Hello guys, I hope and pray that you're fine wherever you are. I welcome you again to this platform, and today I want to discuss something about Africa in relation to a speech that was delivered yesterday by none other than the Pan-Africanist Julius Malema. Now, yesterday Julius Malema met other Pan-Africanists at Lukenya University in Kenya, and Julius Malema attended a conference, let me call it a conference, with other African leaders and other Pan-Africanists in the Pan-African Institute, which was opened yesterday at Lukenya University. Now, during this convention, Julius Malema delivered a very focused speech which touched on issues that are pertinent to Africa. Now, in my view, Julius Malema's speech touched several and critical issues about Africa. In this discussion, I am just going to give an overview of what Julius Malema said about Africa and the kind of advices that he gave African leaders. Now, I will pin the link to the full speech on this video, but I just want to give an overview of what Julius Malema said during this convention. Now, one of Julius Malema's concerns and one of the issues that he touched on, Julius Malema said that Africans had a responsibility to show love to fellow Africans. Now, in my view, Julius Malema was just emphasizing the need for Africans to love fellow Africans and the need for Africans to be close to one another. He was stressing the need for brotherhood and sisterhood. You know, for many years now, Africans have lived apart. Although we share the same continent, but Africans have lived apart. We have been separated by the national boundaries that we have today, and we are separated by the traditions, languages, and the rest. And according to Julius Malema, these things, these barriers that undermine African love, undermine African brotherhood, and undermine African engagement were instituted upon Africans by the colonial powers. Now, Julius Malema also talked about the dark side of transatlantic trade. For those who know history, and for those who study history, and for those who did history in high school, you will understand that transatlantic trade was the primary source of slavery in Africa. Transatlantic trade allowed colonial powers to export Africans from the African continent to the Americas, that is the new lands. Africans were forcefully extracted from their homes, forcefully extracted from their families, and forcefully transported in large ships voyages across the Atlantic Ocean to Americas and Europe. Now, Julius Malema talked about the dark side of this transatlantic trade and how it pained Africans. Now, another thing that Julius said was the colonial conquest for settlement aimed at exploiting African resources. Now, we know that colonial conquest of Africa came during the scramble and partition of Africa, when European countries declared interests in various African countries, various parts of Africa, and according to them, they called these various parts of Africa spheres of influence. European countries met in Berlin and they agreed to share Africa in portions. That is what Julius Malema was talking about concerning colonial conquest for settlement aimed at exploiting African resources. And these colonial powers they declared spheres of influence in Africa, mainly to exploit African resources, to control African resources, to have access, unlimited access to African resources, to support their industries. Another thing that Julius Malema talked about, which I have always mentioned on my discussions, is the notion that Africans cannot handle their own affairs without imperial supervision. Now, Julius Malema was just referring to the present notion that Africans are inferior. You know, these foreign governments, these colonizers, former colonizers, they view Africans as inferior. They believe that Africans cannot do something which is effective. They believe that Africans cannot rule themselves. They believe that Africans are incapable of developing effective economic, political, and social plans, and they must always supervise Africans, and they say they help African governments to make decisions. But in a sense, and according to what Julius Malema said, these neo-colonial governments, they want to supervise Africa. They want to make sure that Africans are controlled, are ruled, are under them. Now, I think the Pan-African spirit cannot allow Africans to be ruled. The Pan-African spirit cannot allow Africans to be controlled by these foreign governments. Julius Malema emphasized the need for African countries to manage their own affairs, African countries to control their own political, social, and economic affairs. Now, Julius Malema also talked about the issue of Haiti. You know, the issue of Haiti has been at the center of Kenyan politics for some time now, for some months now. And the Kenyan government got a nod from the United Nations Security Council to send soldiers to Haiti. And many argued that Haiti should be considered as an African country. And Julius Malema supported this notion. According to Julius Malema, Haiti belongs to black people, regardless of the color of their skin. You know, we know that Haiti was formed as a country of former slaves, free slaves, and these slaves were formerly Africans. That is why Julius Malema was saying that Haiti belongs to Africa and it comprises Africans regardless of the color of their skin. Now, apart from the case of Haiti, Julius Malema also recognized the role of revolutionaries in Africa and across the world. And when he talked about these revolutionaries, because he was in Kenya, the first reference point was the Mau Mau fighters. You know, for those who read history, you will know that Mau Mau fighters are the linchpins. They are the architects of independence in Kenya. They fought colonial governments and they made sure that these colonial governments were driven away from Kenya and Kenya gained independence. Now, Julius Malema recognized and appreciated the roles of the Mau Mau fighters in Kenya in fighting for Kenya to gain independence. He also appreciated the roles of Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Harriet Tubman, Aisa Kaseme, Pielo Lumumba, Seiko Ture, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Francois Fanon, Haile Selassie, Julius Nyerere, Charlotte Matheke, and Winnie Mandela, among other revolutionaries who selflessly participated in the liberation of Africa. Now, another important point that Julius Malema cited in his discussion was the issue of foreign companies engaging in the merciless exploitation of African resources. According to Julius Malema, mineral resources, land, oceans, animals are still owned and controlled by the colonial masters. Now, this is true, although I know some might dispute this. Currently, Africa is not free, and Africa is yet to be free. Most African countries claim to be independent, most African countries claim to be free, and most African countries claim to be sovereign. Yet, in the real sense, these countries are not sovereign, these countries are not independent, and these countries are not free. African countries are still under the yoke of colonial governments. African countries are still under the yoke of neo-colonialists, and African governments are still under the control of these former colonial masters. Julius Malema recognizes this fact, and during this discussion, he emphasized that mineral resources in Africa, land in Africa, animals in Africa, oceans in Africa are still owned and controlled by the colonial masters. I have always emphasized on this platform that Africa's freedom will rely on its ability to control its own affairs. Africa will only be free if it is capable of making its own decisions without colonial interference. But currently, since African countries make their decisions based on colonial interests, African countries cannot be considered to be free, sovereign, or independent. Julius Malema, while adding on just the point that I have mentioned, said that no countries in the entire African continent that have gained full economic emancipation and independence. That is just emphasizing what I have said. There is no country in Africa that is economically free. There is no country in Africa that is politically free, and there is no country in Africa that is socially free. You will still find foreign governments such as the United States dictating to African countries what they should do. You will still find foreign governments such as France dictating to West African countries how they should organize their politics. You will still find foreign governments such as Britain dictating to Kenya how they should organize their social affairs or economic affairs. This is what Julius Malema was referring to as no African country has gained economic emancipation or independence, because these African countries are still under the control of colonial governments. They are still under the yoke of our former colonial masters. Now, Julius Malema also referred to a 2016 report which was titled The Neocolonialism, which revealed that the 101 British companies listed on the London Stock Exchange that control an identified 1.5 trillion US dollars worth of resources in Africa in just 5 commodities, including oil, gold, diamonds, coal, and platinum. Now, Julius Malema was just noting the fact that African resources benefit and contribute to the general development of foreign governments. African resources contribute to the massive economic gains in these foreign governments. By giving an example of the London Stock Exchange and the 101 British companies listed on the London Stock Exchange controlling 1.5 trillion US dollars worth of resources in Africa in just 5 commodities, Julius Malema was still emphasizing the fact that these foreign governments never went away. These colonizers never left Africa, and these colonizers still have very strong ties in Africa. And that is what I always say, that neocolonialism in Africa is alive and well, and the same is emphasized by none other than PLO Lumumba. Still on these 101 British companies on the London Stock Exchange, Julius Malema said that many of these companies do not provide the figures of resources they control, and majority of these companies are found in DRC because they are the ones who fuel the divisions in DRC. They are the ones who fuel the fight in DRC, and they are stealing the resources of DRC because they know there is no proper accountability. Sorry. Now, the case of DRC Congo, I have discussed a lot. And at one time, I said that these foreign governments might be the ones sponsoring chaos in DRC. I did say that these foreign governments must be behind the instability in DR Congo. Now, Julius Malema, who is not an ordinary politician, Julius Malema is a Pan-African, a leader in South Africa, and a revolutionary. Julius Malema supported my claims that these foreign governments are sponsoring chaos in DRC Congo for them to give them opportunities to fully exploit resources in this country. Now, according to Julius Malema, these foreign governments, they control majority of these companies that are found in DRC, and these companies are present in DRC mainly to exploit the mineral resources in DR Congo, and they might be causing chaos in DRC to give them proper opportunity to exploit these resources. Julius Malema is saying that these companies are present in DRC because there is no proper accountability in this country. I encourage the president of DR Congo, that is President Felix Tshisekedi, to try and solve the crisis in the country. I also encourage African governments to try and help DR Congo to solve the crisis in Congo. And I also emphasized the need for the people of DR Congo to call for the removal, for the withdrawal of these foreign governments in their country, because the instability in DRC, the current instability in DR Congo, is as a result of the operations of these foreign governments. These foreign governments are sponsoring chaos in DR Congo to give them that opportunity to exploit and control these mineral resources. Julius Malema also talked about the issue of the French, and according to Malema, all French puppets must be isolated, and all French soldiers and militaries must leave Africa, and no foreign armies in Africa should be entertained. Now, Julius Malema was just of the opinion that there should not be foreign military bases in Africa. I think for those who follow this platform, you will realize that I talked about the issue of foreign bases, and I emphasized the need for all African governments to remove and close down these foreign military bases. I questioned why the United States must have a base in Kenya. I questioned why the United States must have a military base in Uganda. I questioned why the United States must have a military base in Somalia. I also questioned why the United States must have a military base in DR Congo. Does this mean that African countries do not have adequate military? Does this mean that African governments are not capable of protecting themselves? Does this mean that African armies are inferior? Julius Malema supported my opinion and supported my thought that all foreign military bases in Africa should be closed down, and these foreign governments, foreign soldiers, should leave African countries alone. I think by allowing these foreign governments to be present in Africa in the form of military bases, that is just encouraging neo-colonialism in African countries. African governments must ensure that these foreign military bases are closed down. All of them are closed down in Africa. And this is what Julius Malema emphasized, that foreign governments' presence in Africa is a threat to African independence and sovereignty. Another thing that Julius Malema said concerned African presidents being invited to this, they call them foreign trips. There was an incident when African governments were invited to, was it Russia or was it Russia or Britain? I don't know, it was Russia or Britain, I can't remember very well. But African governments, African presidents were invited to meet one of the foreign presidents, and images circulated on social media of African presidents bungled in buses. African presidents were put in buses and they were transported to meet this one president as a group. Julius Malema was of the opinion that African presidents must realize that they are equal to these presidents who invite them. He equated African presidents to Putin, that is the Russian president. He equated African presidents to the US president, that is Joe Biden. He equated African presidents to the Chinese president. And he said that these people are equal because they are all presidents. And the issue of inviting African presidents as a group to meet one foreign leader should not be condoned by these African leaders, because in a way it demeans Africans, it demeans African leadership, and it demeans Africans as a whole, Africa as a whole. In my view, I think that when these African presidents agree to be bungled in buses and they agree to be transported in groups to meet one president, they are, I think, stooping very low. They are demeaning themselves, and they should maintain that authority and recognize that they have the same roles, they have the same authority as Joe Biden, as Putin, and as those other foreign governments, even King Charles. Julius Malema also said that our African leaders like colonizers than us, which is true. Another important point that Julius Malema cited was the need for African countries to demolish borders. I said that these borders that we are currently enjoying were instituted upon us by these foreign governments. Foreign governments, European governments, met in Berlin in 1880, was it? Berlin Conference was 1884, 1885, yeah. And during this conference, they did agree that they will portion Africa. They will divide Africa among themselves. And these countries agreed to divide Africa based on resource availability. For example, Kenya was given to the British, and other parts of Africa were owned and controlled by other foreign governments. Now, these foreign governments, after declaring spheres of influence, they instituted these borders to show areas of control, to delineate, let me say delineate their areas of control. And when African countries gained independence, they assumed these borders. They encouraged these borders, and these borders currently divide Africans. Julius Malema emphasized the need for African governments, African countries to remove these borders, and Africa to remain as United States of Africa, a united continent with one race. Julius Malema also strongly criticized the Kenyan president. For those who know and follow the politics in my country, Kenya, you will understand that Kenya is not currently in a good economic situation. The political landscape in my country is failing the people. I have always maintained that we have no need to trust politicians, because politicians will tell you one thing during campaigns and they do another after being elected into political office. And this is what drove Julius Malema to criticize the Kenyan president and the Kenyan administration. According to Julius Malema, what President Ruto promised during campaigns is completely different from what he is doing now. For example, Julius Malema cited the issue of the dollar. He said that President Ruto promised Kenyans and Africans that once elected into political office, he will remove the dollar, the overdependence on the dollar, and Africans will have their own currency. What President Ruto is doing now is encouraging more colonial control in Kenya, which in a way is encouraging the use of the dollar. Julius Malema emphasized the need for African countries to have a one currency, minted using African resources, minted using African gold. And that is, I think, what even the former Libyan president, that is Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, wanted. He wanted a united Africa under a united African dollar. Julius Malema was strongly criticized the Kenyan president, and he said that the Kenyan president is acting completely different from the one who was making promises during campaigns. Another issue that Julius Malema raised with concerning the Kenyan president was the recent visit to Kenya by King Charles III and the Queen Camilla. Julius Malema said that President Ruto put a red carpet for a murderer, and he called King Charles III a murderer. Why was Julius Malema calling King Charles III a murderer? Because, for those who know, British and Britain colonized Kenya. And during the British colonization of Kenya, many people were killed. During the Mau Mau rebellion, many Kenyans were killed. And according to Julius Malema, putting a red carpet to a leader in charge of a country who killed our own people is like entertaining a murderer, appreciating a murderer, saying that what you did to Kenyans was good. On the issue of King Charles, Julius Malema was of a different opinion. He said that King Charles III, when he visited Kenya, he was somebody who showed no remorse to Kenyans because of what Britain did to Kenyans. And in Malema's view, King Charles, the least that the king was to do was to say, I am sorry and I apologize for the atrocities that Britain committed on Kenya. Julius Malema also gave the Kenyan government options. He told the Kenyan government to decide to be Pan-Africanists or colonial puppets. I think the Kenyan government has decided already, and they have decided to be colonial puppets. I said on one of my discussion videos on this platform that the IMF was making decisions for Kenya. That means that the IMF was calling the shots in Kenya. The United States is controlling Kenyan politics. UK is controlling Kenyan politics. And other countries, foreign governments, are controlling Kenyan politics. This simply means that Kenya has decided to be a colonial puppet. Another issue that Malema talked about was concerning the ongoing Hamas-Israel war. And Julius Malema criticized the Kenyan government for supporting Israel in this war. I think the Kenyan government supported Israel because the United States was supporting Israel, because United States and Kenya are buddies, are friends. Now, Julius Malema was of the opinion that what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip is simply murder, and it is trying to murder Palestinians. Julius Malema compared what is happening in the Gaza Strip as somebody coming to your home and telling you to leave your home, and if you decide not to leave, they kill you. That is what is happening in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, according to Malema. Israelis are killing Palestinians in their own home and forcing them to leave their own homes, and if they don't leave, they are being killed. Julius Malema supported Palestinians and he supported Hamas in the ongoing war. The last thing that Malema talked about, which I have also talked about mostly in my videos, is the insecurity and instability in Congo. Julius Malema said that before you speak about other countries, charity begins at home. Before Kenya talks about the ongoing war between Hamas and Israel, before Kenya talks about the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, Kenya must be in the forefront to solve the crisis in DR Congo. And Julius Malema said that without peace in DRC, Kenya will not know peace. And I think I said this in one of my videos. I said that when there is war in one African country, then other parts of Africa, other African countries will not know peace. This applies to when there is war in other parts of the world. Africa cannot know peace. That means that every African country must be peaceful, and if there is an African country that is currently at war, then African governments must decide to solve such crisis and restore peace and stability. With these concerns and with these citations, I believe Julius Malema gave an insightful speech to African countries and African governments. And if African presidents are very serious, they should listen and apply all the recommendations that Julius Malema gave during his conference at the Pan-African Institute in Lukenya University in Kenya.